Oh dear. Hey guys, and welcome to the Coffee and Coding Podcast, the show where we discuss everything there is to know about app development. I'm your host Rob J, and in today's episode, I chat with Yelp Android engineer Yuan. We talk about working with internal libraries and why they're useful, writing open source software, dependency injection, declarative UI frameworks, and more. Now on to the show. So I guess the first thing that I'm kind of interested in, so I was looking at your LinkedIn earlier today, and you've got Yelp on there, you've got Hootsuite, you've got Intuit. It doesn't seem like you've worked at any small companies. They're all like super serious, big companies. So how did you get started in app development?
Yeah, so Hootsuite was the smallest company I worked at. And then my school has a pretty good co-op program where it has a lot of local Vancouver companies. And I did apply to a lot of smaller companies. I knew I wanted a mobile position. I didn't actually know if I wanted to Android or iOS at this point because I was just like in my third year of college. And then Hootsuite was the company that offered me a position. So I thought so I went with that.
Okay, nice. So did you learn Android while you were at Hootsuite?
Pretty much. Before Hootsuite, I also was doing some projects with friends. We did iOS and Android because, like, as I said, I didn't know which one I wanted to go with, but they're very simple compared to what you would do at work. Like, I didn't know about RxJava or Dagger or anything before Hootsuite.
I also noticed, I think this is right, when you were at Hootsuite, that you worked on a bunch of internal libraries that they use in their app.
Yeah. So one of the ones I worked on was Nachos, which was like an open source material chips library. That was actually started by the previous intern, and then I was adding a bit to it.
I guess kind of what I wanted to ask was, so obviously you've worked at a bunch of big companies, so how many of them kind of employ that idea of building parts of their app into libraries, and how do you find that approach? Because all the companies I've worked at, their app is one big code base. There's no internal libraries. It's just one big thing. So how do you find working in that way?
So at Hootsuite, one problem with having a lot of libraries is the dependencies, because sometimes you have like multiple layers of libraries dependent on each other. Now that I think about it, like some of that could have just been modules instead of standalone libraries. But I think back then modularization wasn't as popular. This was in 2017.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Part of the reason some of them were libraries was, as I mentioned, some of them get open source, and then that's kind of nice.
So do you think they would have took the modular approach if that had been an option back then?
I think so. We ended up building a tool in Ruby on Rails to actually just manual to go into Grado and then bump all the dependencies and then create pull requests. So we had a Ruby script for that. So I think a module might have been easier, but it was a pretty cool Ruby script.
Yeah, that sounds good. We do something similar, well, actually a few places I've worked at, but using GitHub Actions, because I don't know Ruby. So.
Oh yeah, that didn't exist back then either.
Yeah, right.
GitHub Actions would have been good.
You mentioned one of the interesting things for you was learning Kotlin back when it was brand new. So can you talk a little bit about what that experience was like? Because I didn't pick it up until probably like 2 years after it had kind of hit Android, and probably actually when it was in Android Studio, like fully supported. So what was the experience like previous to that?
I think I got really lucky that Hootsuite decided to go for Kotlin as soon as 1.0 came out, because back in 2017, I don't think that many companies were using Kotlin yet. But I mean, first we had to actually figure out how to learn it. So what we did was go through Kotlin Cohen's. That's their tutorial for kind of learning the types and collection functions. And then we also did a reading group where we read Kotlin in action. That was the main book for learning Kotlin at the time. I think now a few more have been published. But yeah, like we read books together. And yeah, in general, there weren't too many resources available yet. For example, there was no official style guide. So we kind of had to make up our own and then decide whether or not to use Java conventions or make up our own. Like, one thing we really discussed was whether or not to use Hungarian notation. And then now no one really uses Hungarian notation for Kotlin.
Yeah, I wouldn't even know where to start with that. So on the stuff that you work on now, is that all Java, not Java, is that all Kotlin, or is it still hybrid kind of Java Kotlin?
Yeah, so at Yelp, because it's such an old, it's been around for many years. The idea is we decided not to convert existing code to Kotlin, but all our new code will be Kotlin. So I write mostly Kotlin, but if I have to kind of go into an older class, it's going to be in Java. This was different at Hootsuite because the app was slightly newer, so we actually put in some effort to convert even older classes into Kotlin.
That seems a sensible approach. I think that's the approach a lot of companies have taken. It's just new stuff should be in Kotlin, and then eventually you end up with a whole Kotlin code base, which is so much nicer to work with.
Yeah, for sure.
So another thing that I wanted to ask about is, so you've worked on a library called Bento, and in the kind of like the GitHub page, it says it's a declarative UI framework. So for the layman's, including me, what is a declarative UI framework and what is Bento? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
The declarative framework is kind of in opposition with imperative UI framework, which is more common in Android right now. So with imperative code, you're describing how to do what you want done. So for example, like if you're setting visibilities for a view every time the state changes. And then for declarative code, you're basically describing what you want or describing the UI state, and then the framework will kind of set the visibility for you instead of you having to manually set UI states. And then, yeah, like declarative UI frameworks are getting more popular now. On web, there's React, and then there's Vue, and then Flutter and Jetpack Compose are also declarative UI frameworks for Android. So
how is that? I assume it is, but in my head, I'm trying to work out how is that different from, so imperative would be that you have, I have a view, I press a button, and then I say that I want this view to now disappear. And then I press a button and I've got another piece of code that says I want this view to now show. How is a declarative framework different from having data binding on that view that says when a state of something changes, change this view, or are they similar?
The thing is, I don't think Bento is actually fully declarative. I think Jetpack Compose is trying to be fully declarative because in Bento, sometimes you still have to manually set some view states. I think the reason I consider it declarative is it's more modular. It abstracts away a lot of the recycler view logic for you. So instead of you manually kind of having to figure out the placement of the cells and handling the different view holder types, Bento handles that for you. And it's kind of similar to Airbnb's Epoxy.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I've worked with Epoxy before, so I kind of get that idea of how that works.
Oh yeah, Bento is more similar to Epoxy than it is to Jetpack Compose, for example. And I think Epoxy is also kind of declarative, but still has a bit of imperative.
Gotcha. Have you worked with Jetpack Compose at all?
I've looked at sample code for it, and then it does remind me a lot of React, but I haven't really tried writing stuff in it because I feel like it's still so in flux. It's hard to say what the...
Yeah, it's changing all the time. I looked at it maybe 6 months ago, and it went over my head, and then I just thought there's no point in me trying to learn this until it's finalized what it's going to be, because it's going to take me forever to learn, and then it's going to change. So
yeah, I've been kind of trying to keep track of what's happening with Swift UI to get a sense of what might happen with Jetpack Compose, because that's iOS's equivalent, and they released it sooner than...
I was going to say that's a lot more mature now, right? Like I think it's been out for 6 months at least, like properly supported.
Yeah, I remember talking to some iOS friends, and then at first they were like, oh, we don't really want to use Swift UI, but then because Apple added so much support for it, they are starting to use it, and that might happen with Jetpack Compose too.
Yeah, I feel like the iOS developer crowd is a lot more, they're a lot faster to pick up things than the Android development crowd. We seem to take a while, like something gets fully supported, but nobody in the community is interested to about a year afterwards, whereas Swift UI, everyone's like, oh my God, it's out, let's do it now.
Yeah, I guess I don't know that much about iOS development, but for Android, I do feel like people want to feel like something's stable before.
Yeah, I feel like that's part of the Google problem as well, is that they change things so often that you want to make sure before you start learning this that you're actually learning something that's going to exist in 6 months' time.
Yeah, like you want to make sure other major projects are using it too before you commit to it, even if Google already recommends it.
Yeah, totally. Another topic that I kind of wanted to touch on is you wrote an article on Medium about dependency injection, and kind of just wanted to talk about, in generalities, what is dependency injection? How is it useful? When do you use it? Basically, that kind of thing.
So there's like the solid design principles when it comes to design patterns for writing good code. And then the D in solid stands for dependency inversion. And then dependency injection is supposed to kind of support that. So I guess I can think of an example. So there are a few. So if a car class needs an engine object, there are a few ways you could provide that. The car can either create its own instance when it initializes, or it can have it supplied as a parameter in its constructor, and then the app can provide that dependency / parameter. So then the car doesn't actually have to worry about where it's getting the engine or how it gets the engine. So that would be an example of dependency injection. And it's nice because it makes the code more reusable, because you don't have to think about like what engine you're creating. It's very nice for testing, because instead of creating a real engine when you want to test a car, you can just pass in a mock one.
I guess my question is, so I've worked with Dagger before and I didn't find it a very enjoyable experience. I think that was because I was kind of junior when I worked with it. But I recently started working with Cohen and I really like Cohen. So have you worked with both of those, and do you have a preference?
I pretty much have the same experience as you. So at Hootsuite, it was all Dagger, and then at Yelp, it's a bit of Dagger and a bit of Cohen. And we've kind of decided to move towards Cohen because it's so much easier to work with. And then I read that Cohen has slower performance than Dagger, but I haven't noticed it at all, and Yelp is a pretty big app. And it's very nice in Kotlin. So if your projects are mostly in Kotlin, Cohen looks very nice when you use it.
Yeah, 100%. I think for me, Dagger was very much a copy and paste what someone else has done experience, because I didn't really understand how it worked, as opposed to like Cohen, where you can actually figure out how it works and you can do cool things with it. So
yeah, and then Dagger has a lot of boilerplate, so just to set it up.
Oh yeah, a lot of boilerplate. That was the copy and paste aspect for me, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to do it from scratch.
Have you looked at Hilt at all?
No, I haven't actually.
Oh, it was just announced, and I haven't written any code with it or anything, but I was just reading about it, and it's supposed to kind of be a layer on top of Dagger that Google's making to help with the boilerplate, but I guess that'll be interesting to see where it goes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, all right. I'll have to have a Google for that afterwards, because that's no pun intended, but that sounds pretty interesting. So another question that I wanted to ask you is, I saw somewhere, and I was trying to find it just before this call and I couldn't, so I'm hoping that I'm right, that I think it was either a paper or a talk that you did with someone else about machine learning.
So I took a machine learning course, and then our talk was kind of mostly from the course and from the machine learning projects that my club was working on. But then I haven't worked with it in a professional setting, because I feel like at most companies you wouldn't both be doing mobile development and machine learning. But yeah, I think the one part where it has come to use is like for looking at analytics at Yelp, because there is some overlap where you might be writing some Python scripts and you might be running a Jupyter notebook, but I haven't done like actual machine learning outside of that class and some school projects.
Okay, fair enough. I thought I'd ask just in case, because it seems super interesting to me. Another question is, so you mentioned that you have skills in like design, UX, HCI, and the question is kind of, what's the process like when you work on your own personal projects, including like using those things as opposed to just focused on code?
I guess before, like when I have a product idea, I would normally go into the App Store and look at some existing apps that have similar functionality, and that would give me a sense of what are the user experience patterns that already exist for that. And then when it comes to mocking design, sometimes I just draw on paper if it's a small project that it's more for learning purposes than me actually wanting to create a polished version. But then if I want it to be more polished, I might draw mocks on Figma instead. I would say Figma is very easy to work with. I never like officially learned it, but I've just like looking at designs from work and from like designer friends, I picked it up and found it really easy to work with. And then I would say, like, even if you don't know much about design, like one way to make your app look pretty nice is to just pick a color and font palette and stick with it. So you can look online for that. And then Material Design also provides guidelines in terms of that. And then there are a few sources I use for icons and drawable assets where it's like open source SVG images. I can send those to you and you could maybe put them in the show notes.
I'll put them in the show notes. Perfect. Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah, so you don't have to draw your own illustrations, but there are some ways to find nice ones.
Okay, cool. All right, nice. So do you have your own apps anywhere on the Play Store or something like that?
I don't have any on the Play Store right now. I just kind of put the code on GitHub and then...
Okay, cool. So just like fun side projects. One other thing that I wanted to ask. So because you've worked at so many big companies, right now you're at Yelp. So in your time of doing like development, what's kind of the most interesting thing you've done or the most interesting technology that you've worked with?
So Yelp uses MVI, which is like model view intent, and we have an internal library for that called auto MVI, and I find it really nice to work with. So you actually it's built on top of an event bus using RxJava, and then you're just kind of firing events between presenters and views, and it's really nice. And we've been thinking about open sourcing it, so hopefully that'll happen.
So working with MVI, am I right that you've got your view, which would be I don't know, let's say fragment or something, and you've got presenter, and then the way that they would communicate would be firing intents to each other?
Yeah, that sounds about right. So at Yelp, the presenters fire states, which are like view states, and then the views fire events. And I think MVI is so new that people kind of take the idea and go in very different directions with it. Like that's what I've noticed with MVI.
So how do you like working with that versus, so most recently I've started working with MVVM, and I kind of like it. If I'm being like totally honest, I find MVP, MVVM, all of these kind of things, they're fairly similar. There's small changes. How do you find working with MVI?
I like it because it really reduces boilerplate, and then the testing setup we have is really nice. But as I mentioned, I think it varies so much between companies and projects because I don't think there's anything first party supporting it really. So people just kind of make up their own way of doing it. I know some companies are using Kotlin Flow to handle it. Some companies are using RxJava.
Okay, cool. So it's a bit of a Wild West in that sense.
Yeah, so I feel like if you don't have anything internally set up for it, or you plan to invest in that, I think MVVM might be easier to work with since there's so much first party support for it.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, I suppose getting into it is a bit easier because this is how you're supposed, quote unquote, supposed to do it, as opposed to MVI, which is do what you want.
Yeah.
So kind of in closing, but I've got a few questions before we finish, which I ask everyone because I find it super interesting. So the first question is, what do you think separates an okay developer from a great developer?
So I think the technical part is kind of the more obvious one. I would also say maybe communication skills will be very important because like assuming you're working with a team or even your own project that you'll be maintaining for a while, it's kind of important to keep the communication open. And then I feel like there is kind of a trap to make your code clever instead of understandable. And then this kind of ties into the communication, but like what's most important is that your code is understandable and easier to maintain, even if it means it's not the cleverest or most concise solution.
What machine do you use to work from?
I've always used some kind of MacBook Pro for development. It was kind of when I was trying to decide between Android and iOS, I needed to be able to run Xcode as well. Yeah, my current home laptop is a 2017 MacBook Pro, and then my work laptop is a 2019 one with the touch bar. Okay,
nice. So MacBook Pros all the way.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And then where can I direct people to in terms of projects you might be working on, or where can people find you online?
GitHub and LinkedIn would be most of where my coding things are. And then I use Instagram for art, so I can link you all three of those. And then.
Oh, okay, cool. I actually saw that mentioned. I think it was on your LinkedIn somewhere about art for Instagram. I didn't manage to check it out yet, but I will do.
Yeah, sure. I can send you all the links.
Big thanks to today's guest, Sherry Yuan. You can find Sherry on LinkedIn, GitHub, @FrostyShadows. You can find Bento on the Yelp GitHub, and you can check out Sherry's artwork on Instagram. As always, you can find everything we talked about in this episode in the show notes. If you like the show, tell a friend, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating. It's much appreciated. And if you really like the show, you can support it with a coffee donation at coffeeandcodingpod.com/buymecoffee. Caffeine is literally what fuels this podcast. If you'd like to connect with like-minded developers, you can do so in our Facebook community. And finally, you can follow me on your favourite social media platform @lowcarbrob. You can find all the links to everything I've just said in the show notes or at coffeeandcodingpod.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Coffee and Coding Podcast.